All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you all had a great week. Today we have the pleasure to host Dhanya, who is a somewhat new prof at Mila. She joined last January, and she'll give us an overview of the research done in her lab about learning causal variables in machine learning. So before handing the mic over to you, Dhanya, let me remind you all of some house rules. So as usual, clarification questions will be allowed to be asked during the talk. For people in person, if you have a question, you just have to raise your hands and I'll give you the mic in order to ask your question so that people online can hear you. And for people online, I'll be monitoring the chat. So whenever you have a question, you just have to type the word question or I have a question. And when the time is right, I'll let you directly ask it. There'll also be some additional time at the end of the talk for people to ask further question or have a more informal discussion with Dhanya. That's pretty much it for me. So whenever you're ready, Dhanya, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rim. Maybe would you like to hit got it on this computer here? Yeah. Perfect. So as Rim said, I am a somewhat new faculty member here at Mila at UDEM in the Department of Computer Science. I say somewhat new because I joined last January. So at this point, I'm not fully new, I'm just newish. So my research is at the intersection of causality and machine learning. And this field of causal machine learning broadly concerns itself with many different problems. I would say one big area of interest is around extrapolation and out of distribution generalization. Another aspect of interest is discovery, scientific discovery, and understanding the causal dynamics of the world through the means of causal models and latent variables as well. And so this part of, or today's talk, I'm going to kind of focus on the latter aspect of causal machine learning. So I'm going to tell you about one of the slices of research that we do in my lab around learning causal variables with machine learning. So I'm interested in causality. And so in this talk, what I'm going to do is I'll start by giving a sense, motivating why I think causality is so important for so many open research problems, many of which we are still interested in tackling today. Then I'll give sort of a brief technical introduction to one of the languages with which we can define causality. And then I'll motivate the opportunities for machine learning by asking this question of, if causality is so important, why don't we see it so much more ubiquitously? And then I'll highlight an open challenge to causal inference that I will motivate machine learning as a tool that can maybe help us tackle this open question. Okay. So to start, why is causality so important, especially when we concern ourselves with various decision-making problems? Okay, so to motivate this, I'm going to give you a scenario. Suppose all of us here, we want to know how to write customer service complaints to get quick responses. So what we go ahead and do is we gather a data set of written customer service complaints and their corresponding response times. So we can actually do this. For example, in the United States, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau allows people to log complaints. And there are also labels on how quickly, or rather, whether these complaints were responded to in a timely manner or not. And then here's an example of a written complaint. Yes, this is a real actual complaint. So this is the kind of data we have. And let's say what we do is we train a classifier to predict timely response or not, the label of interest, from the complaint text that we have. And we have a finding. We find that complaints that are angry have a higher probability of timely responses. Putting this a little bit more mathematically, we have the text of the complaint, and we have a label Y, which monitors timely response or not. And we find that the conditional probability of timely response is higher when the text features encode for angriness of the complaint. Okay, so now I have a question for all of you and the folks online as well, but I'll look at a show of hands in person here. So raise your hands if you think we found a very robust policy of write angry messages and you will get fast replies. So how many of you would start writing angry complaints? Okay, so there's 2 people that want to write angry complaints, which, you know, go for it. We can run this experiment, but I think a lot of you had this intuition that maybe conditional probabilities are not the right thing to model predictions under interventions, right? This idea of a policy, the idea that we want to take action in the world and modify our behavior to start writing angry complaints, conditional probabilities may not capture the change under intervention. So why not? For example, maybe the story of the world is that the thing that you're complaining about both affects how you write complaints about it, and the topic might also have an effect on response times. So for example, we actually analyzed these CFPB complaints, and we found that in fact, there are certain topics like complaints about financial products that are typically angry, they're impolite, if you will, and they generally receive fast, timely responses. Okay. And so when we want to decide how to act or intervene, we need a mathematical language that tells us how probabilities change as a consequence of manipulations, right? So what would be nice is if we had a language that told us when we take an action to write angry emails, to make every single email angry, that, you know, for example, in this particular model, there would be no effect on the response time. In fact, there is such a language, and we'll formalize it in a few slides, but this is the motivation behind causality, right? It provides us with exactly this calculus of interventions. Now, causality is not a new topic. It's very long-standing, and if we look at the world, there are so many examples of decisions being made and brought about as a consequence of causal inference. So, for example, perhaps the most common technique that a lot of us might be familiar with are randomized control trials. In particular, a lot of the medication and effective therapeutics that have saved lives have come about as a consequence of randomized control trials, which is one of the underpinnings of one of the techniques that allow us to do causal inference. If you're familiar with micro or macroeconomics, there's a lot of work on natural experiments. So for example, there was a really interesting, in this case, a study about how race actually affects how people are treated by police in terms of being stopped for traffic violations. And what they did was they used this random shock that's provided by the daylight saving time change, which suddenly makes it harder for police to see who isn't actually in a car. And so they can use this random source of variation to also tease apart causal effects. Okay, so if you're familiar with work in economics, you'll see a lot of work on quasi-experimental methods. In fact, in 2021, economists won a Nobel Prize for the revolution in quasi-experimental methods. And finally, there's also work on causal inference from purely observational data, which seems wild. I'll talk a little bit more about when this is possible. But for example, one famous finding about the link between smoking and cancer was in fact really fueled by an observational study, right? So there was kind of evidence collected from observational data that suggested this strong link between smoking and cancer, which was attempted to be disproven in courts by positing an unobserved genetic confounder that made it much more likely for people to both smoke and have cancer. That was disproven by Sander Greenland in this kind of famous paper about sensitivity analysis. And so causal inference is there in the world, especially when we're trying to make policy decisions, when we're trying to figure out how to act on the world. This is fundamentally a language, a technical language that we need. Now, I argue that a lot of our open problems continue to need causality for this exact reason. For example, in the field, the broad area of climate science, right, we're needing to understand which policies have the biggest effects on reducing climate emissions. In the areas of drug discovery, personalized medicine, therapeutics, we're still in need of effective therapies for many, many diseases, right? So again, this field of scientific discovery and causal inference in clinical settings. Even in dialogue support, decision-making, and large language models, there's still a lot of questions about how agents should interact in conversations with humans to achieve effective dialogue. And then in the realm of decision-making, there are a lot of questions about fairness and whether perceptions of people affect how other people make decisions about them, right? So underpinning all of these questions is this idea about what would happen if we were to make a change in the world. And for that, we need a causal calculus. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of problems, but this is just sort of 4 examples that I picked that I think are nicely embody the kinds of questions that we find compelling today. So now I've hopefully motivated why this need for thinking about a language of interventions is important. Now I'm going to give you some brief introductory tools that show us that we can, in fact, mathematically define causality. And to do this, I'm going to talk about causal graphical models. These are directed acyclic graphs that allow us to represent probability distributions. I want to emphasize that this is just one language for defining causality. This is not the only language by any means, but for the purposes of today's talk, this particular language is rich enough. For the rest of this talk, we're going to assume that our treatments of interest, the thing that we want to intervene on, is going to be binary. Okay. The theory of causality does not break if the treatment is not binary, but it's for ease of exposition, we'll just assume this. Like standard directed graphical models, if you're familiar, these graphs can tell us how to model observed distributions, right? They tell us that the distribution of these variables factorize in a particular way that depend on the graph. But causal models have a secret superpower, right? They do more than just model the observational distribution. They also entail every single interventional distribution on these variables. What do I mean by that? So you see that I've introduced this operator called do. The do operator tells us which variable we would like to intervene on. Graphically, an intervention means simply that we sever all incoming arrows to that variable, and we'll write a new factorization. The new factorization replaces the initial conditional probability of T with a delta distribution that assigns all of the mass of T to one constant value and keeps all of the other factors exactly the same, right? So what's key here is that we have introduced, by a small change in the conditional probabilities, a new family of distributions. This is not the same family as the observed distribution family, but we've been able to entail an interventional distribution. And we can do this for every single variable in this graph, right? So we can use these same calculus, the same rules, to talk about the interventional distribution when we intervene on Z and when we intervene on Y. And the crucial detail here is to notice that this particular entailment tries to reuse these conditional distributions, or factors as they're sometimes called, again and again across all of these interventional families. So let me just pause here really quickly for any questions. Any questions at this point? Okay, awesome. There may be something in the chat, but I'll move on for now. Now, I've given a language, but we still need to figure out how to use this language to express scientifically meaningful causal questions, right? So a very common thing that is done in the causal inference literature is this focus on causal effects. Effects are just contrasts between two different interventional distributions. The most common such effect is probably the average treatment effect, which looks at the mean of the outcome variable y across two different distributions. One in which we intervene and we set the treatment to 1, the other in which we intervene and set the treatment to 0. Okay, so it's just a contrast of the means of two different interventional distributions. And just this picture, I hope, conveys that there's nothing special about this object here. I mean, there's something special, but it's not mathematically any different than any other probability distribution. We can still ask about its mean. We can still ask about marginalization, conditioning, and so forth. The do notation simply tells us which distribution we should index into to ask our causal queries. And in this case, it's saying that we want to think about a world where we manipulate the system and assign, for example, every patient to taking the drug, and then a different world where we assign every patient to not taking the drug. So this is the average treatment effect, also called the ATE. And at this point, right, it should not be immediately obvious that we can even draw causal inferences, because I'm talking about these quantities from distributions that we can't literally sample from. Sometimes we can sample from it if we're working in a yeast lab or with some other kinds of model organisms. But in general, we cannot literally intervene and give everybody a particular treatment and prevent them from taking a treatment. I think I saw a hand.
Sorry, I don't know if you said it and I missed it, but if T wasn't binary, then the right-hand side term would be like an expectation over all other treatments?
Very good question. So what kinds of effects can we have when we have non-binary treatments? There are many. For example, there's ways of talking about dose response curves where you look at the function as a variation, as T, the constant value of T varies. You can define other types of contrasts where you say, maybe I'm going to consider some value, some baseline rate of T, and then add some constant to it.
Thank you.
Good. So let's get back to this point. It's not immediately obvious that we can even say anything about causal questions, right? Until we notice that what gives us hope is that the observational distribution and these interventional distribution, in fact, they're not the same distribution, but they in fact share a lot of parameters. They share a lot of conditionals. Everything in the observed world can be in theory estimated from data. And so that gives us some hope. And so in fact, indeed, this consistency plus other assumptions, typically involving the graph structure itself, sometimes allows for inference even without non-interventional data. Let me give you some examples of graphs that permit causal inference, and I'll give just intuitions as to why, but I am going to kind of keep it pretty high level for the purpose of this talk. So I mentioned already randomized control trials. Why do they work? They work because at the distributional level, they kind of mimic the interventional distribution. So, in randomized control trials, what we're doing is randomly assigning the treatment. And by doing that, we're severing the link between the variable Z and the treatment itself. Anyway, it's not literally like intervening on every single person and making them take the drug and not take the drug, but at the level of distributions, this kind of mimics the structure of the interventional distribution. In this graph that I've been showing, right, where we have variable Z that affect the treatment, which we typically call confounding variables, we can still say something, in fact. We need an assumption here that all such confounders are in fact observed. And there are techniques that manipulate the graph that are called adjustment that allow us to make causal inferences about the ATE. Even when there's hidden confounding, right? Even when the confounders are not fully observed, sometimes there are variables that allow us to still do causal inference. And I, again, alluded to natural experiments, and the structure that permits causal inference there is the presence of an instrumental variable, a variable that induces variation in the treatment that is as if random. And so I'm going to give some kind of brief intuitions of how causal quantities map to observational quantities. So in the RCT case, the interventional mean is simply the conditional mean of the outcome in the treated and the untreated groups. It's a little bit more complicated in the confounder graph, but all this is doing is essentially marginalizing out Z. It's even more complicated in the natural experiments case. There we have to solve an inverse problem based on the variation that the instrument induces in the outcome variable. So I'm not going to go into technical details there. And I'm also omitting some other serious heavy hitting assumptions here, but just for simplicity. At the end of the talk, I'll point to a bunch of textbooks that you can read to learn more about causal inference at its foundation if you're interested. Also, you can come take my class. Good. So it sounds like I'm giving a bit of a tutorial about a topic that is both long studied, there are a lot of techniques. Then why don't we do this all the time? I'm seeming to talk about a topic that we know a lot about. And, there's a straw man argument here, which is, oh, there's a lot of assumptions. Maybe that's why we don't do it all the time. But I argue that it's something different, which is the reliance on measurements.
Michael online is asking if you could give an example of confounding variables.
Sure. Yes. So, for example, let me use this slide. So, for example, in the clinical setting where maybe T is the choice to assign a drug to a patient or not, and Y is the disease status, the confounders might be your health status, right? Which affects both whether or not you choose to take the drug and how you'll recover from taking the drug. Great question. And so I argue that one of the things that hinders how much we can apply causal inference is this need for domain experts to carefully be able to measure the treatment of interest, the outcome of interest, and even more so, the confounding variables of interest, right? And why does this seem like such a pernicious problem? Well, if I think about these research settings that I stated as being very important to kind of the research we do going forward, often we're not measuring the variables, the abstract variables that we care about directly. Rather, we're collecting these kind of low-level measurements. So, for example, in climate science, we of course collect lots of climate data, but if we're interested in macroeconomic sorts of questions, then we're collecting these huge tables that involve economic factors. In the clinical setting, we're collecting clinical measurements both about patients, but also biological samples, which again are high dimensional and sort of low-level signals. And in the context of dialogue agents as well as decision-making, we might be collecting conversation logs or lots and lots of text interactions. And for more general decision-making purposes, we might be collecting just general interactions between two different agents, right? And the key structure that underlies all of this is that these low-level measurements implicitly encode the causal variables that we're interested in, like the possible causes of some outcome of interest, all confounding variables, the outcomes themselves. But we rarely ever literally record, the status of the treatment, the confounding values, and the outcomes. Often we may not even know which treatments to study. We just may believe that, I have this text, and somewhere in this text lie all the possible causes that I might be interested in. So we need to kind of adapt the framework of causal inference to this setting where now we don't have clean measurements of anything. Now, this might remind us of, the contrast with machine learning, right? Where our modern methods in particular routinely work on these kinds of low-level inputs like text and visual inputs and biological sequences. And they routinely just extract these abstract task-relevant variables from unstructured inputs. And so for the rest of this talk, what I'm going to focus on is this question of, can we learn, using the paradigm of machine learning, representations that serve as substitutes for causal variables like the causes of interest or the confounding variables of interest? Of course, you could do outcomes as well, but I'm not going to talk about that in this talk. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about two recent papers. The first one tackles this question of, can we learn representations that act as if confounding variables in a causal inference of interest? The second part of this talk, I'll talk about, can we learn potential causes from low-level inputs? Rather, can we learn representations that mimic potential causes? Okay, so for the first part of this talk, I'll talk about a paper on adapting text embeddings for causal inference. And let me kind of give you a motivating example that'll help round this particular topic. Okay, it's a little bit, silly, but it's a nice example to help us think about the setting. So suppose we have this data generating process where we have theorems that occur in papers or not, and we have data on whether they're accepted at a conference or not. And we have the subject of the paper being a confounding variable here that is hidden from us. But let's say we also have paper abstracts. And it's clear that the subject of the paper is going to be encoded in the text of the paper abstract. And so we might be interested in this question of, what is the causal effect on acceptance of having a theorem in your paper, right? Potentially very compelling for lots of people. So is this setting clear? Does anybody have just questions on the data generating process or what we're kind of talking about here? Great. And again, for now, the presence of a theorem or not is just going to be thought of as a binary variable. So the first assumption here is assuming that the text contains all the confounding information. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we could use the full text as a representation of the confounding variables if we wanted. That means that the text itself does not essentially lose any information about the subject of the paper, but it could contain potentially much more information than obviously just the subject. Okay. Now, why wouldn't we want to do this, right? Like, do I need to go any further with this problem? We don't want to do this because, as I said, the text contains many potentially high dimensional nuisance variables that are not confounding for a problem. With perspective to the causal inference task at hand, these are just complete nuisance variables, right? And adjustment, as I alluded to, involves marginalization, and our effect estimation becomes statistically very inefficient if we were to marginalize over lots and lots of nuisance variables. Okay, so we don't want to do this. So what we want to do is learn a mapping phi of x such that the mapping, the representation kind of acts as a substitute for our latent confounder z. Okay. Another way to say this is that we would like the representation to contain all of the confounding information, but nothing but the confounding information. Okay, so let's kind of, go with this thought experiment. So let's just everybody pick your favorite representation learning method. This could be anything from self-supervised approaches, deep generative models, contrastive methods. You can fit a topic model for the old school probabilistic modeling people. And you can do this and you can learn some representation. Now, have we solved the problem now? Is this good enough? So two things can go wrong, right? Depending on how we set up our objective, if we were a bit careless, phi of x could fail to recover all of the z relevant information, right? We might learn a variable that loses information about z. Another way to say that is it's not bijective with respect to z. Or another problem, which is kind of more likely, is that phi of x continues to retain a bunch of irrelevant information. So how are we going to target this causal variable z? What are we going to do? So we can set up two desiderata, right? We want to train representations that first learn to reconstruct x well, and thereby capture as much information about z as possible. But we want to regularize. We want to throw away anything that is not going to be z, and we're going to use the graph structure to inform that choice. So here we see that the particular observable implications of this z variable is that it is predictive of both the treatment and the outcome. Okay, so we can use that to come up with a supervision task to train this representation to further predict both t and y. Okay, so let me give you an example of one method that we instantiated for doing this, with the caveat that you could kind of adapt this technique using your favorite representation learning approach. But in the context of text data, we have an implementation with BERT. So BERT takes a sequence of tokens, the paper abstract as input, and with the representation that is produced by BERT for the entire document, we train it to predict the probability of treatments. So you can do this by just minimizing cross entropy loss. And we also train it to predict the mean of y given both the treatment and this representation. This particular choice has to do with exactly how to implement causal adjustment, but these are the two tasks. At a high level, you can think of this as what I said. We're learning a representation that predicts t well and y well. And all of this is jointly trained with the unsupervised objective, which in the case of BERT is to predict the mass tokens. And so this kind of serves as a proxy for the reconstruction of the document itself. Yeah, I have a question in the back there.
Yeah, just briefly, could you just remind me, like, why is it a problem if we don't reconstruct X well? Like, all we care about is like the intervention's effect on Z, right?
Good, that's a good question. So the reason is essentially because depending on how we set up our tasks, so let's say I have some contrastive estimation that I set up where I want to do some kind of prediction using data augmentations, and I have the text itself and then some version of the text where style variables are corrupted, but the topic stays the same. That drives me towards picking up particular types of information, which is topic. But what if style was in fact the variable that was confounding for our problem, right? So this idea of setting up the objective carefully to initially try to reconstruct X basically tries to get me to learn every variable that is essentially as good as observed in the X data, right? So variables that are basically injective with respect to X, the text. And then now that we have, Z plus a bunch of other stuff, then we regularize and try to throw away the other stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Awesome. Good. So I'm going to skip the details about effect estimation, having said that essentially causal adjustment involves, marginalizing out of Z. And the key detail is that these predictions that the model makes, P of T being 1 and E of Y conditioned on T and some stuff, these predictions suffice to estimate causal effects. These predictions are all you need to estimate causal effects. Okay. But how do we evaluate these kinds of methods? We can't simply make predictions to evaluate the quality of effect estimation because the output of effect estimation is a single number, right? It's a single causal effect for one particular data set. And we don't typically have ground truth ATEs lying around for different data sets. And so what we did was a particular semi-synthetic evaluation strategy in which we used real data. So we in fact used peer read, which is this openly available data set that in fact does contain paper abstracts and metadata that tells you whether there's a theorem in the paper or not. And what we did was we used another covariate, another metadata that was given, which is whether or not there's a buzzy word in the title. And we found that buzzy wordness is predictive of theorems in papers. And it does also show up, this information is also encoded in the paper abstract. And now that we have a plausible confounding variable, and we have an observed treatment, what we do is we simply simulate outcomes, which is sort of the simulated probability of being accepted at a conference using these given variables. Yeah. From T to X, we don't need the T to X arrow. Yeah. Always when we write down causal graphs, we're making a claim that we believe, up to some kind of benign indeterminacies, like we kind of like believe this graph. That's where we're starting. Good. So we simulate Y's using these observed variables, but it's very key to note that in order to evaluate how well our methods are able to recover confounding information, we obviously don't provide the ground truth confounder to our effect estimation methods. Okay, so the whole point is to give them X and T and Y, the simulated Y, and see how well they can actually recover the buzzy titleness idea from the paper abstract text itself. So we did a lot of empirical studies in the paper. I'm just going to kind of talk about one finding here. And this is where we compare the method I talked about, Causal BERT, with an MLP that takes raw text as input and predicts T and Y. So in essence, it's doing the thing that I described earlier, where we don't have any objective that reconstructs X. Okay. And so what do? We varied the dependence between the confounder and the outcome to create a lot of different data sets where the problem is either really easy because there's no confounding or very little confounding, or really hard because the confounder has a big effect on the outcome. We have a ground truth causal effect, and just as a kind of straw man, we also reported a method that does no causal adjustment. So, by virtue of correlation not being causation, we can see that the unadjusted method is extremely biased, especially as the confounding grows. And there are a couple different other symbols that you see here that have to do with slightly different ways of actually calculating the effect. Don't worry too much about that. The key thing to note here is that, yes, in fact, as the bias grows, this neural network that is doing some adjustment, because it is in fact learning a representation from text in order to predict T and Y, it is less biased than the unadjusted straw man. But we see that in fact, Causal BERT yields the most accurate causal effects. And this trend is something we saw in basically a lot of studies that we did, including some sensitivity analysis as well. Yeah, I have a couple questions here.
Thank you. Just can you explain what the numbers are here?
The numbers are here. Yeah, exactly. Those are literally just the reported causal effects. So the ground truth effect is 1, right? It means that it literally means what the ATE means. It's like, as I contrast putting a theorem in a paper and not putting a theorem in a paper, the mean of Y changes by like 1 unit. And then everything else is just a reported causal effect. And so things that are close to 1 are more accurate.
Thank you.
How are the ATE computed here? AT, the computed AT, any specific algorithm or
The ground truth, you mean, or
both?
the estimated? So the ground truth, you have counterfactual Y's under both values of treatment. We have a simulation model, so we can literally calculate both Y under both interventions, do that manually. For the methods, it's what I said. So I said it at a high level, but the predictions that are made by Causal BERT, which was the probability of treatment as well as the mean of Y, those predictions suffice to estimate causal effects. They're well-known estimators. This is like really well studied. These estimators only require those predictions. Okay, so we had these kind of semi-synthetic results, and in sum, right, this particular idea here is when we have the graph structure, we can use that as a signal to learn representations that act as substitutes for one type of causal variable. In this case, it was the confounding variables. There are, of course, limitations, right? For example, sometimes X contains other kinds of variables that might also have some role in this entire causal data generating process. In particular, there's some variables called mediators and variables that might be almost copies of the treatment that, in fact, if we do adjust for, it biases our causal effect estimation. So there's a subtlety in like what X might encode, and guarding against these kinds of issues is the subject, in fact, of some ongoing work with students. Okay, so this is simply one approach to representation learning to recover some type of causal variable. And now let's think about what if we want to learn causes, not confounders. And so now I'll talk about some work that's very new. It's with colleagues here at Mila. So this is with some awesome students, Jason, Sir Elliot, Jason, Seb, Mathieu Blanchette, who's not a student, he's a prof, and myself. And the motivation for this part of the talk, suppose that we want to study the effects of some latent macromolecules on some disease phenotype of interest. Okay. For now, let's not even think about confounding variables and so forth. We just have some latent causes. Maybe it's the level of a whole bunch of different proteins, and we want to understand how they affect some disease phenotype. Okay. It feels like we've already hit a wall. The causes are latent. What do we do? We often have high dimensional data. For example, in this case, we might have gene expression, and the gene expression measurements they cause the protein levels to vary, right? So we have, in some sense, we can observe the high dimensional parents of the latent causes. And so, okay, how can we learn some representation that acts as a substitute for these latent macromolecule values so that we can do causal inference and understand how proteins affect diseases? So as before, we can kind of fit a neural network, right? We can kind of push through with that approach. So let's say we train a feed-forward neural network to predict the outcome, which is some disease phenotype, from the gene expression measurements. And we take the last hidden layer and we treat that as a substitute, as a stand-in for the latent causes Z. And then we go on to do causal inference using the values of the last layer. Okay, will this work? To consider that, let's just consider a simple linear outcome model. Okay, so some coefficients. Suppose that in truth, the true model that was affecting Y based on the protein expression levels just depended linearly on the protein expressions. Protein levels, sorry. Now, notice that there's this task of predicting well doesn't constrain our solutions for Z, right? There's actually many different solutions that you can construct by applying a transformation to Z and then undoing that transformation before you predict with the weights W. In other words, there's a lot of solutions, phi of x, that can transform x in some way and yield valid solutions to this prediction problem. Okay. Here's just sort of a visual representation of that. And what do these solutions do? What they do is they entangle the values of the latent causes, right? So each entry of phi of x is in fact some combination of all of the causal variables. And so now when we think, can we use this in fact as a valid substitute for causal inference? It kind of becomes clear that you can't, right? Because the causal effect of the true Z won't be the same as the causal effect of some linear combination of Z1 and all of the other variables. Forget about there's a small typo in the slide, just ignore it. Okay, so simply predicting Y is not going to do. For the purpose of actually doing causal inference, it will not suffice, though it suffices for prediction. So what other learning signals can be used to constrain the solution space more and try to learn solutions that are semantically the same as the causal variables that we had to start with, which are latent? So what we're going to do is, in fact, leverage data from multiple environments. Okay, we're going to leverage samples that are coming from a whole bunch of different distributions, which I'll use E to index. Now, we're going to need to establish some invariances across these distributions. And so we're going to assume the following invariances / variances, right? So we assume that the distribution of the features, X, so the distribution of gene expression could vary across environments. The mapping from gene expression to protein level stays the same. But the mapping from proteins to the outcome could in fact change a little bit. And I'll say very precisely what I mean by change a little bit, okay? And just to kind of give a bit more intuition why we're motivated by this problem. In fact, we're motivated by a lot of problems in biology where you have this kind of different distributions that you can think of as maybe species or cell types, where the functional mapping between the causes and some outcome of interest evolves or mutates a little bit, and that mutation or the evolution is very structured. So that structure is what we're going to exploit, and here's how we're going to do it. And again, just to be clear, we're going to assume still a linear outcome model. So in this framework that the mapping can change a little across environments, this is the expression that we get. Okay? So in each environment, the Y is going to have different linear coefficients W to map it from Z. And we're going to assume that the environments are hierarchically related via a known tree. What does that mean? What it means is that these weights in every single environment, right, have a very particular structure to them. So the arcs of the trees give us some offsets, and to construct the weights, the WE at any given environment, we're going to take the weight of the root environment and then add this linear offset delta. Okay. So just as one more example, for example, if we want to think about what will the weights be in environment number 4, we have to kind of traverse the tree, and we see that we have this length 2 path along which each edge we have one offset. So W4 is going to be the root weights plus the offset from the first edge and the offset from the second edge. Crucially, these offsets are going to be sparse. Okay, what does that mean? It means that the way that this mapping evolves or changes across environments preserves a lot of information across environments, right? So mostly the coefficient of just a single latent cause is going to vary across environments. Okay, so we call this one sparse. And this vector here is just sort of a toy illustration of that. It doesn't literally have to be an entry of 1, but this is just to kind of conceptualize. And so in sum, right, this data generating process, this model shares these root weights, and then we're going to characterize all these, we're going to need to learn all of these offsets. Okay, so the parameters here are therefore the matrix of the offsets, delta, which you'll have one for every arc in the tree, and then the root weights, W, which I'll call W0 or W0. Any questions about the model? Okay. Let me just look in the chat. There's a clarification question. How do these environments differ? In biology, would they be batch effects? No, this is not batch effects. So, for example, these environments, right, they're coming from known data generating processes. So in this case, you can think of these environments as corresponding to cell types or maybe species, right? So this relationship between environments is known. And what we're asserting is that, for example, if you think about disease phenotype and species, then as you evolve from one species to the children, there's going to be sparse changes in which mechanisms drive the disease phenotype. Okay. Now, if I presented this, oh yeah. Okay, I've presented this model. Now, why does this work, or how is this going to work? And so the method that we introduced is called tree-based regularization. And what it's going to do is train a model to both minimize the risk, rather, or the way to think about it is minimize the prediction error across all environments, but also enforce that the offsets, right, which captures the changes across environments, be sparse. And how we do this is by enforcing a L0 norm on the matrix of these offsets, delta. Okay. Why would we do this? Why is this going to get us towards learning causal variables, learning causes, right? Why does this help? Now, to see this, let's just consider our entangled solution, right? The thing that we would have gotten if we threw away that sparsity penalty term completely and only minimized empirical risk. Now, this learned representation, I already said, right, can apply a transformation to the true Z's, and it can always learn to undo that transformation. And if we just think about the form of our data generating process, to minimize prediction error, we need, for example, to undo this rotation both across the root weights, plus also the offsets. And for ease here, I'm just assuming there's a single arc. Okay, so that's just delta sub E. But notice that this matrix, sorry, this term, which is the delta sub E offset, rotated, transformed by A inverse, generally it's not going to achieve a sparser solution than the true solution. In fact, because the transformation A inverse is typically dense, it is in fact going to produce a quantity that has a higher L0 norm than actually the true solution. So this is the signal that we're going to use to try to pin down the correct solution among all of the possible solutions that are good at minimizing the risk. Okay, so any questions here about this intuition?
Yeah, there's one online. Janbo is asking, the hierarchical sparse tree assumption is only on P of Y given Z. How do we ensure that Z, the variables, are disentangled from each other?
Yeah, so let me kind of maybe finish the chain of argument that'll help us kind of see. That's right. So we're going to be penalizing delta. We're not literally penalizing Z in any way, but notice that, for example, this particular tree-based regularization is not going to prefer solutions that have this form delta A inverse, right? And since A inverse is connected to A, which is the thing that is linearly transforming the true Zs, by enforcing this penalty, we're also going to implicitly ask for the A matrix to have a very special form, which is that only permutations and coordinate-wise scaling will be allowed because only those are the kinds of A inverses that will result in an L0 norm that is as low as the norm of the ground truth solution. So maybe let me just maybe move to the next slide, which states this a little bit better. So the solutions for phi of x, the representation that generally minimize the L0 norm, recover the true latents up to permutation and scaling. Okay, so they produce matrices A that kind of have this structure, right? So you can permute the coordinates of the latent variables in the learned solution. You can scale them component-wise, but you can't arbitrarily entangle them, right? And the idea is basically you can learn to undo this permutation matrix to minimize prediction error. And you'll get a norm for your delta that is as low as the ground truth delta, as the one that the ground truth delta would achieve. But any other matrix, any matrix that applies a denser transformation to the true Zs, will also have to learn to undo that dense transformation, thereby densifying the solution and sort of achieving a lower objective value when you have this penalty, the sparsity penalty. So that's the intuition. And this is just the result is stated informally here. There's a lot more technical details, and all the technical details go towards or in service of establishing exactly what needs to be satisfied so that this chain of reasoning, this line of reasoning is actually true. Yeah, I have a question.
So does this assume that the ground truth tree has this sparse structure? And if it only approximately has this structure, does the result break down?
You are perfectly foreshadowing the next slide or the next couple of slides. So thank you. Good. So we'll show the empirical evidence of this theory, and part of the regime that I'll show will be when in fact that sparsity doesn't exactly hold. Good. So we and I know I'm kind of nearing the end of the talk. I'm almost done. So just maybe like 5 minutes. So we in fact simulated some hierarchically related environments where the linear Z to Y map varies, and we vary the sparsity of the changes. So the theory holds for what I showed, which was the one sparse case where one latent factor has its coefficient changing. And we're gonna we're gonna implement the tree-based regularization by fitting representation phi of x with feed-forward neural networks. Okay? And these don't necessarily match the ground truth x to z map. Okay, so there's again some sensitivity analysis that we account for. Okay, so the left axis is the metric, which is the MCC score. At a high level, when the MCC score is 1, then you know you've recovered a permutation scaling transformation of the true Zs. On the x-axis is the level of sparsity. I said the theory works in the one sparse case, but we compare other regimes, and I'll talk about what happens then. And so in the zero sparse case, right, when actually there is no change to the mapping across environments, there's no learning signal, in fact, for the tree-based regularization. Unsurprisingly, this approach doesn't seem to disentangle any better than a naive neural network. Very unsurprising. In the case where the theory holds, we see exactly what we expect, which is that tree-based regularization, seems to achieve almost perfect disentanglement, certainly much higher disentanglement than the baseline neural network. And then in all of the other regimes, the sparsity level assumptions are violated to different extents, but we see some robustness of TBR to the assumption violations in practice, right? So it's still, you see the quality of the disentanglement get worse, but it's still not as bad, it's nowhere as bad as the baseline neural network. Good. So now, okay, there's this question of these representations that we've learned that recover the true causes up to some kind of benign transformations, some benign permutations and rescaling. Does this suffice? Does this kind of help us do causal inference in a valid way downstream? So what we did was we estimated the average treatment effect on Y of each of the causes, each ZK, and we compared the effects that we would estimate using a whole bunch of different representations. The one learned by TBR, the one learned by the baseline neural network, and those learned by the ground truth causes Z. Okay, and we talked about batch effects a little bit earlier, and just for demonstration, we're not going to have any hidden confounding here, which, for example, one source of hidden confounding could be batch effects, right? Okay. And what we see is maybe what we would expect, that in fact, when the true causes are learned up to permutation and scaling, these indeterminacies that still preserve the semantics of the causal variables, we get much more accurate effect estimates, almost close to what we get with the ground truth. While when we use entangled representations, we basically, in fact, cannot estimate causal effects. We'll get very, very biased estimates. Okay, and so in sum, what we wanted to do was to learn causal variables here, the causes themselves, up to some benign indeterminacies. And we did this by leveraging sparse changes in the effects that these causes have on our outcome of interest Y, right? In our example, it was a disease phenotype. And there's a lot of exciting work here to be done. This is sort of a ongoing research agenda in which we would like to extend the theory to nonlinear maps, adapt to less sparse changes than what we require, and there are many other things which I can discuss offline. So I'll just conclude now by just kind of highlighting some open problems. And to do that, let me just kind of remind us again of where we began, right? And I'm kind of saying that we want to be very ambitious and tackle these huge decision-making kinds of questions. And there's this question of, well, have we done enough work in machine learning and causality to be able to tackle all this? Are we done? And there's still a lot of work to do. So, for example, I believe, just not exhaustively, but that some important questions that we need to be able to answer are around being able to leverage interactions and the perspective of agents, embodied agents that act in the world, and then also understand how this view of causal variables and causal models among latent states might actually help us with interactive settings like those in RL. I think there's this question of, for example, how do we leverage these tools in causality as well as machine learning to extrapolate to completely unseen interventions? This is sort of like the OOD version of the causal inference problem, where we'd like to know how to simulate data or think of data generating processes from interventions we've never even seen before. And then sort of my kind of pet interest is in thinking about latent variables that aren't like all the ones I've shown so far, which were as good as observed, right? And what I mean is sort of second order latents like, mass or acceleration or force or things that are just not even observable in visual inputs. These are the kinds of variables that humans learn how to invent and embed into their theories of the world. And so in order to kind of have more rich causal abstractions and theories of the world, I think it's really important to think about many different kinds of latent variable inference that go beyond what we've studied so far as a community. The last thing I'll say is that, when you give talks like this, it sort of seems like, you're coming up with stuff in a vacuum, but in fact, this work that I've presented here today builds on some incredible foundations. And so, for example, if you'd like to learn more about this area of causal machine learning, there's an incredible survey paper by Bernard and many others that are here at Mila called Towards Causal Representation Learning. I highly recommend it as a place to kind of get insights and intuitions on this topic. And if you're interested in the foundations of causal inference, there's some amazing textbooks. Of course, the classical seminal work by Judea Pearl, but there are others by, again, heavy hitters in this field like Hernan and Robbins and Vincent Rubin. And there's also a ton of incredible literature on the identifiability of representation learning, which this whole talk builds on. So for more references on that, you can just email me and I'll be happy to point you in the right direction. So with that, thank you so much for being here today on a really crappy snowy day. And thanks for listening. And I'll be very happy to have a fun discussion now and also offline.
So we have a little bit of time for a few questions. Are there some in person? Okay, so Sammy, you had the question at the beginning. Do you want to ask it now?
Yes, sure. I just refined it a bit since I learned many things in the presentation. Well, thank you very much. I mean, for the future of causality, there might be some challenges, especially when we deal with high dimensional data, and most of the time there might be missing data. And how can you how can we deal with because we need to generalize, right? Even when we find the causes, most of the time in real life we need to generalize it to all population or particular context. And what would be the methods that you would use or for future research to be able to generalize it while also trying to include domain knowledge? Yes. Or there is also this concept of counterfactual reasoning. I'm not sure you talked about it in the presentation, but that would be very interesting if you can give us a word about it. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Did you get?
I'm so sorry, but we weren't really able to hear very much of what you were saying.
Yeah, the volume was very low.
Yeah.
Should I just read out loud what you wrote in the beginning, Sammy?
Yeah, I think that'd be better.
Okay, so he was
thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So he was saying studying causality can be challenging because of confounding variables, the directionality of the causal relationship, the complexity of the relationship, and also the data availability. Still, how do you deal with causality with big data, and especially with complex system and all the ethical challenges?
Great. Good. In some ways, it's going back to kind of the motivations of this talk, right? Indeed, studying causal inference is both tantalizing and really hard because of the strong assumptions that we necessarily have to make. It is a consequence of either not maybe knowing the true causal model in the world, or even if we are willing to make some assumptions, we really have to commit to those assumptions to interpret our findings as causal effects. There's no getting around that. So the way that I kind of view this challenge, right, is that the way forward is to figure out how can we at least get away from this problem of needing very rigid measurements. So how can we, for example, run our analyses with as many causes as we can recover from high dimensional data, or as many confounders as we can possibly recover from some other source of data. It doesn't make the incredibly difficult and unverifiable, untestable problem of assumptions go away. That being said, there's an amazing body of literature in causality called sensitivity analysis, which focuses on parametrizing our robustness to assumption violations, like the presence of unobserved confounding. So I think that we can leverage those fields with this kind of causal machine learning perspective, and I think hope to tackle a lot more problems, at least from the sense of like maybe generating much richer hypotheses that we can then go and empirically verify in a lab or something, right? And then this question of complex systems, that's a good question. And I would say like causality is definitely not at odds with complex systems. I think there's maybe challenges to adapting our frameworks to encode, for example, dynamical systems, to be able to allow for those kinds of processes and equilibrium states. But there's already incredible work in this vein. And so I think, again, there's an opportunity to combine the theory of causality, which is rich, with the empirical successes of machine learning, and kind of find ways to meet in the middle.
Cool. So we're a little bit out of time because Dhanya has a class at noon. So I'll officially end the talk. Thanks everyone for coming. And I really encourage you to continue the discussion with her offline or to check her seminar, Causality and Machine Learning class. Thanks again, Dhanya, for this amazing talk.
Thank you so much.